Yesterday, we looked at the Mishnah on Daf Memtes, and we're talking about a conflict between someone who's on his way to a mitzvah, and on the other hand, he reminds himself he has chametz that needs BIyun. And the Mishnah gave three examples. One was he was on his way to shecht his korban Pesach. The other case was he was on his way to circumcise his son. And finally, he was on his way to a Sa'udat Erusin. And we weren't sure about Sa'udat Erusin, if it's a mitzvah, is it not a mitzvah, under what circumstance a mitzvah, and that will be, in Mirz Hashem, our discussion for today. However, the Mishnah tells us that in situations where it's an either-or situation, he doesn't have enough time to both go back home and destroy his chametz, and at the same time continue on the road in order to fulfill any of those three mitzvahs, then the mitzvahs take precedence because of bittul. He will cover both tashbisu as a mitzvah saseh and prevent himself, avoid violating ba'yiro b'yimotzei through bittul, because midaraisa bittul ba'al masag. The chiyuv of BIyun now at this level after bittul is only the Rabbanan, and the Rabbanan will waive their obligation in favor of those mitzvahs that he's involved in. In the case where he has enough time to go back home and destroy his chametz, and then go back and fulfill those mitzvahs, then that's exactly what he has to do, with the exception of pikuach nefesh. If somebody needs his hatzalah, then we're not going to take any chances. We're not going to say, well, let him go back and destroy his chametz. He's got plenty of time to be metapel with the chole. No, we're afraid of any possible unforeseen delays, and therefore drop the mitzvah b'ir chametz, just be mavata your chametz, and take care of that person who needs your care. In a case of a rishus, the Mishnah says, by contrast, for example, he is going out there on a derech because he wants to be kohen shvisa outside of the bounds of the city, so that he'll get an additional 2,000 amma beyond the Klum Shabbos. But he's only interested in dvar rishus. There's no pressing mitzvah that he has to fulfill. In such a case, he must go back to be mavaris chametz once he reminds himself that he has chametz that he hasn't destroyed. And there are no ifs, ands, and buts here. We're not going to talk about being kohen shvisa. He's going to have to give that up for the benefit of b'ir chametz. Then we discussed the case where a person, which has nothing to do with chametz, reminds himself that he's carrying with him on his road kachim shenifsalu, or kachim that were taken out of Yerushalayim that requires sreifa, that require burning. And the law is that the mitzvah requires that he goes back into Yerushalayim, and in some cases even back into the Azara, to burn kachim shenifsalu. Wherever the psul yotze was chal, in kachim, when he leaves the Azor, in kachim kalim, when he leaves the bounds of Yerushalayim, he must go back to the point where it became possible as yotze, and that's where he's going to burn it. However, the Mishnah has an allotment, a certain permission, a certain license, in a case where he is beyond the limits of the city to such an extent that he will need to retrace his steps when he reminds himself, and he's far away from the city, the bounds of the city of Yerushalayim. He's all the way up on a place called Sofim, which is a high point from which he could see the Harabayis. He's past Sofim. If he hasn't passed Sofim, then he's within that radius of being close to Yerushalayim, and we're going to require him to retrace his steps, go back into Yerushalayim, and there he will destroy his kachim. If, on the other hand, he's already passed Harat Sofim, that's already too much of a tircha to require of him to retrace his steps. The Mishnah then goes on to speak about two these two scenarios of burning his Kodshim Shenifsalu, one is outside Yerushalayim when he passed Sofim, and the other is in Yerushalayim when he has not passed Sofim, he's within the radius. And the Mishnah sets up an afkamina as far as who's going to supply the eitzim, the wood, as fuel for the fire to burn his Kodshim Shenifsalu. Can he enjoy the benefit of the Atzei Maracha, and instead of running around and looking for a log seller and paying out of pocket to find logs to make his fire, here in the case where he's on his derech and he has a place to go, he has his destination, he has his luach zmanim, and now we're forcing him, because he's still within the parameters of Tofim, to go back into Yerushalayim. In such a case, we will supply the eitzim for him. It's an urgent situation. We don't want to waste any time. We're not going to force him to procrastinate, delay, dilly-dally, running around looking for a log seller. We will supply him with the logs of Atzei Maracha for the purpose of burning of his kodsh. Now, at the end of this Mishnah, we have a piece called Ad Kama Heim Chozrim. So let's make sure we're all on the same place. We're looking now at the second Mishnah on Daf Mem Tes Amud Aleph, towards the bottom of the Mishnah, and it's 4 lines up before the Gemara begins, and the Mishnah asks a question, Ad Kama Heim Chozrim. Let's be careful about this. The Mishnah is not asking Ad Kama in distance. We've already established that depends upon whether he has time to go back and do the Sreifa and get rid of his chametz, or in the case of Kodshim Shenifsalu, is he beyond Sofim or within that boundary? This Ad Kama Im Chozrim is not a question about distance, but rather about volume. And the question is about the volume, both in the case of chametz as well as in the case of basar kodesh. What is the minimum volume which is significant enough to impose upon him an obligation to go back home to destroy his chametz, or go back into Yerushalayim to the Harabayis and burn his kodshim shenifslu? How much of a volume of chametz or of basar kodesh is there? And here we have recorded in the Mishnah a 3-way machlokas. Rabbi Meir Omer, Zeve Kabetza, the minimum shear less than which he is not obligated to retrace his steps, is a kabetza, which is more than a kizayis. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Zeve kizayis. We feel intuitively more comfortable with Rabbi Yehuda because we know that the shear of chametz, for example, linyan achila, and therefore linyan bal yirah b'yimatzeh as well, is a kizayis. And presumably, the same shear should apply to basar kodesh. Why then does Rabbi Meir up the ante, which again is a kula, that it's only when he has a kibetza's worth of either chametz or basar kodesh, that's when we are forcing him, if he doesn't forfeit the other mitzvah, we're forcing him to go back. Chachamim omrim, there is a compromise shita here between Rabbi Meir on the one hand, who sets the shear for both chametz and basar as kibetza, and Rabbi Yehuda on the other hand, who sets the shear for both at kizayis. Besar kodesh b'kizayis, chametz b'kibetza. And again, this is a bit odd, to say the least. Chametz, which would be classic Isra Achila, should have a shear of kizayis. Why? And again, this is a question that we asked on Rabbi Meir. In the case of the Chachamim, we have an additional question. Not only are we baffled about the shear of kizayis that was completely ignored by both Rabbi Meir and the Chacham with regard to chametz, and instead we jacked up the shear to a kibetza, But in addition, we have another question that baffles our mind with regard to the Chachamim. If there is a shear called Kibetza, then let's be consistent, because if there's a halacha of achilas Kibetza of Chametz, then there should be a parallel halacha of achilas Basar Kodesh of Kibetza. And instead, the shear, according to the Chachamim, as far as Basar Kodesh, is the classic shear of Kolator Kula of Kizayis. But only in the case of Chametz is the shear going to be a Kibetza. So on this, I have a footnote here in the Masifta, and it's based on a Yerushalmi. Now, how did the Masifta get a hold of this Yerushalmi? This Yerushalmi is actually tucked away in an earlier parak in Pesachim, and it's quoted here by Tosfos Divrei HaMaskil Chachamim. So if you'll take a look at the next to the last Tosfos, in which Tosfos quotes the Rivah, who in turn quotes the Yerushalmi, and I'm going to read to you a summary of Tosfos. You'll follow it inside if you can. Basar Kodesh ein lo takana b'bittul. If you have Basar Kodesh that has to be burnt, Bittul is not going to in any way alleviate you from that obligation to burn Basar Kodesh and Ifsal. And therefore, we have more of an inclination with regard to Basar Kodesh to be machmir, because here we're dealing with a doraisa. In the case of Chametz, because of the possibility of avoiding the need to go back and burn the Chametz under the law of Tashbisu, we can avail ourselves of the possibility of Bittul, which reduces the entire enterprise of Bir Chametz to a Drabanan. We have more room than we have in Basar Kodesh to be Mekil. And therefore, since in the case of Chametz, which has a takana b'bittul, and that will reduce the chiyuv bir to a drabanan, lo chmiru rabbanan ela ad kibetza. Again, this doesn't answer our fundamental question, where the shear of kibetza flew in from. You know, where did that egg drop from? But at least we understand the fundamental distinction of the Chachamim between the case of Chametz and the case of Basar Kodesh, which requires Sreifa. Again, we're not going into the nuances of Kibetza versus Kizayis, but what we are saying is that if there's going to be a Kula, it's going to be in Chametz. And if there's going to be in a Chumrah, it's going to be in Basar Kodesh. And that is because whereas Chametz has a proviso of ownership, which can be circumvented through Bittul, in the case of Basar Kodesh, there is no such proviso, and Bittul will not in any way mitigate your obligation vis-a-vis the Basar Kodesh. So where there's no takana in Basar Kodesh, no way of circumventing your obligation, therefore we have to be more machmir. We're going to take a lesser shear, and we're going to obligate him, if he's within that boundary of ad sofim, to retrace his steps in order to burn the Kodesh, even at a very small minimum size of volume of Kodesh, namely a Kizayis. In the case of Chametz, since we will obligate him in any event to be Mavatal the Chametz, the Rabbanon did not rely on Bidika and Bir. They required, in any event, Bittul. And that will guarantee that we're dealing with not a Doraisa, but rather a Drabanan. The Rabbanon were more Mekil, and they said you don't have to schlep all the way back for the sake of less than a kibetza. That's what we have in Tosfos. That's a summary of the Rivah in the name of the Yerushalmi. But here in this note, he has a kasha of the Chassam Sofer. And he says the following: although I agree, and that's undeniable, that Bittul, as far as Chametz, is a takana on a doraisa level, but what about Kodshim? Are you saying that there's no takana in Kodshim and we're left with an Isa Doraisa? That's not so. Im Sarfo Bimkomo, if he burns the Kodshim wherever he is, let's say he is all the way out there at Sofim and beyond, he will fulfill his mitzvah Doraisa. However, as far as the Mishnah, which requires Lifnei Bira, which means that he has to go close to the Azara, which is called the Bira, Hadin L'Sarfa Lifnei Bira Eino Ela Midrabanan. That requirement of going back to the Bira and burning the Kodshim there, let's say in the case of Kodshim, is only the Rabbanan. And he says, if you don't believe me, then study Tosfos Divra Maskil V'Sarfo, which is the third Tosfos on the daf, and you'll see that Min HaTorah, Tosfos has a proof from elsewhere that on a Doraisa level, he says the following. He says, it's a din not in the Masechet, which requires a certain locale, but rather it's a din in the Chefetz of the Basar. Wherever on the face of the globe you destroy that Basar, you have fulfilled your obligation on a Doraisa level. The Rabbanan required a Bira situation, and therefore the Chassam Sofer says, I don't follow this Yerushalmi. If the Yerushalmi's goal in explaining the Chachamim who lowered the standard in Chametz to a Kezayis vis-a-vis Kodshim, where they were more machmir, because in Chametz, by virtue of the option of Bittul, he reduced it from a Doraisa to the Rabbanon. The same option of reducing Doraisa to Rabbanon exists in the case of Basar Kodesh, because Tosfos is already committed that the requirement of Sreifa the Bira is only the Rabbanon, but Midoraisa Sarfa B'chol Makom. V'ein Lomar, he rejects a possible answer. B'chol Makom Midrabbanon Sarach Sreifa as Basar Kodesh Lifnei Bira. And don't tell me that Midrabbanon he has a requirement of burning the Basar Kodesh in the Bira. He says, Aregam B'chametz. Midrabbanon Sarach L'Sarfa. V'lo dai b'masha bitlo. In both cases, you're at a level of a D'Rabbanan. Now, we mentioned in the past Rabbi Yonasan Milunil, and he says something here very cryptic. He writes, again, he's way before Chassam Sofer. He writes, Atam lechiluk bein kodshim lebein chametz, who shebekodshim mipnei chumraso hichmiru sheyachzar afilu al kizayis. Now, this is pretty fascinating. Rabbi Yonasan Milunil completely circumvents the Tosfos, ignores the Yerushalmi, comes up with his own original idea that this is a chumrah in kodshim. We once discussed hoil, if you remember, and we said that even if you hold of hoil, but that's only as far as the kula of yontif is concerned, but hoil l'chumrah in kodshim is something that we accept. We also have gemaras about tumah v'tara, that, for example, in chulin is only a level of tumah that reaches the level of a shlishi l'tumah. In kodshim we have a revi in tumah. We also have an entire chumrah called chibas hakodesh, that whereas all other chulin require what's called hechsher l'kabel tumah, one of the Zion mashkim. Otherwise, v'sheretz falls on chulin, it's not metame without a machshir. In kodshim, they were machmir. It's called maila osu b'kodshim, that even in the absence of one of the machshirim, there still is kabbalas tumah. We find many chumras in kodshim vis-a-vis chulin. And therefore, the Rimi Lunil classifies chametz as chulin, but Basar Kodesh belongs to the sphere of kodshim, and this is a chumrah in kodshim that the Rabbanan required you to go back and retrace your steps in order to do the best job possible of Sreifa Bebira. Truth be told, there are a number of, again, in my humble opinion, a number of issues that have to be addressed according to this BIyun. First of all, do we find a chumrah in kodshim shenifsalu? When we talk about kodshim, we're talking about kodshim that are royal in Mizbeach, and now we're going to exclude them from the Mizbeach because of a Tumah V'Tara situation. Things of that sort of Chibas HaKodesh. But when you talk about kodshim psulim, I don't know that we have a Maila also b'kodshim in terms of the mitzvah of Sreifa. But the BIyun said that that's why the Rabbanan required Bira. They want you to retrace your steps back to the place where it became possible, where the Yotzei was Chal, and right outside the Azara. And that already is Begeder a Rabbanan in order to impose awe and fear of Kedushas Kodshim. That's the BIyun. Now, the second element in the equation, that we don't have to be machmir in chametz because chametz is chulin, which is, it's hard to disagree with the BIyun about that if you want to be argumentative. However, we find many chumras in chametz that don't exist in Shari Surei Torah. First of all, the chiyuv bir itself that we're discussing is a chumra that the Torah required in chametz, and the Rabbanan took it one step further, and they said we require physical destruction. We're not going to rely, as the Torah did, on ashbasa b'leiv. In addition, the Torah imposed 2 lavim of bal yirah b'yimatzeh on chametz that don't have any parallel in any other of the machalos asuros. So that if I have orla and klei kerem and basa b'cholav, there's no bal yirah b'yimatzeh. No one forces me to get it out of my possession. But the Torah does so in the case of chametz. So when we're weighing kodshim shenifsalu vis-a-vis sreifa and bir chametz, and we're on the D'Rabbanan level, I don't know that we have to be more machmir in the D'Rabbanan of kodshim hanisrafim as opposed to chametz hanisraf or bir chametz according to the Chacham. But in any event, we have 2 approaches here to explain the Chachamim's chumrah in kodshim vis-a-vis chametz. Now let's try to analyze the question of the status of a Seudas Erusin. Is it a gewaldige mitzvah? The Mishnah tells us that if he's on his way to eat and partake in a Seudas Erusin, he's going to his father-in-law's house where they're setting up this Suda. If he doesn't have time to get back to his house when he reminds himself he has chametz, destroy his chametz, and then be back on time for the Seudas Erusin. Now, they call the Seudas Erusin for, let's say, 12 p.m. Okay, now, is it Jewish time? Are they going to start the Suda on time? I don't even know what they're going to serve at the Suda. Don't ask me that question. But he realizes it's already 10 a.m. in the morning. He's got 2 hours to get to Beis Chamav. He wants to make an impression on his newly found father-in-law and get there on time. Ich bin a yeki, I want to get there on time. I don't want to delay the Suda. But on the other hand, he reminds himself that he's got to go back to destroy his chametz. And it's already getting late on Erev Pesach. So we tell him that, you know what? If you won't have time to get back home to destroy your chametz and get back on time to satisfy your father-in-law at the time of the Seudas Erusin, then you know what? Just be mevatel your chametz. Ureminu, the Gemara Sakasha, we learned in a brisa that says Aholech lechol Seudas Erusin beis chama, or vil lishbos shvisas harishus. He wants to be Kohen Shvisa and set up his own Erev Tchumen outside the city limits for a purpose of rishus. Is Yachsam Miyad. Interesting. Well, we had Yachsam Miyad, we were talking about a case of Rishus, like, for example, Lishbos, Shvisas Rishus. But the case of Seudas Erusin was classified in the Mishnah, in the Reisha, together with holech lishchot es pischo or lomol es bino, and therefore, if he doesn't have time to go back and forth, then simply rely on bittul. Here in the Brisa, the Sudas Erusin paragraph was placed in the lower part, connected with Hashoves Shvisaso Harishus and Yachzor Miyad. Don't even hesitate, and you'll write a letter of apology to your father-in-law. Sorry, I couldn't make it. Again, it's a little bit strange because if I was the father-in-law, I would say to him, this is not a very good first impression because the Suda does not go on without you. The show doesn't go on, as we saw yesterday in the name of the Magen Avram, without the presence of the Chassan. But in any event, the Shver is going to have to bite the bullet. He'll be embarrassed. He'll have to cancel the Suda, all in favor of the fact that his Chassan forgot that he has chametz in his house that he didn't destroy. How can you forget such a thing? But Chassanim are very tarud. They're what we call obsessed with thoughts about marriage, and we'll let him off the hook. The status of a Sudas Erusin as a Sudas mitzvah, or the absence of that status, depends on a machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. The Sanya, Sudas Erusin Rishus Divrei Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi Omer mitzvah. And now we have a very smooth reconciliation of our Mishnah and the Brisa. The Mishnah reflects the Shita of Rabbi Yossi, namely that there's a mitzvah of Sudas Erusin, and therefore if he's on his way to Sudas Erusin and he won't get back on time, back and forth to destroy his chametz, then it's a Sudas mitzvah, and for the sake of that mitzvah, we Chachamim, meaning the Rabbanon, who require destroying the chametz on a deraisa level, again, as we said over and over again, he's mevatel his chametz. The Rabbanon will say, you know what? For the sake of the Sudas Erusin, we will allow you to forego the mitzvah d'Rabbanan of bir chametz after bit. That makes sense according to Rabbi Yossi, and he is the author of our Mishnah. However, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and he holds that Sudas Erusin is not a Sudas mitzvah. It doesn't have that status, and therefore is a Sudas Rishus. His Shita is reflected in the Brisa that combines Sudas Erusin in one breath with the case of Shoves Shvisas Rishus. You want to have a Sudas Erusin, that's fine. But don't call it a Sudas mitzvah. It's a Rishus. As I said yesterday, we intuitively relate very well, we're very comfortable with Rabbi Yehuda, because Bishleim is Sudas Nisuin. After Nisuin, after the Chuppah, there's a Simcha of Chassan V'Kala, the Mitzvah to be Mesamech the Chassan Kala. But Erusin? I mean, the Gemara says, in Masechet Moed Katan, you're allowed to be Ma'aris and Ishi even on Tisha B'Av. There's no violation of Avelus in Erusin, because Erusin is not a Ma'aser Simcha. He's living where he's living. She's living in the father's house. And that's where they'll go on like that for a full year. And Erusin is nothing more than a formal kinyan. I mean, I'm not trying to belittle Erusin. She becomes an Ashes Ish. If someone has a relationship with her, he and she are Chayiv Misa. I mean, Erusin is not a Milsa Zutrasa. But as far as Simcha is concerned, the Simcha of Ahayu L'Basar Echad is certainly withheld and delayed until Nisuin. And Nisuin is your classic Sudas mitzvah. And at that Suda, it's a mitzvah to be Mesamech the Chassan V'Kala, Kesa Maragdim B'fnei Kala. This doesn't apply to Erusin. We never had a Mishnah or a Brisa that says Kesa Maragdim B'fnei Ha'arusa. And I'm wondering about the Shita of Rabbi Yossi. To me, it's a very new Shita, and the Gemara ultimately will say that even Rabbi Yehuda agrees with Rabbi Yossi. So that's why I'm working overtime to explain Rabbi Yossi. What shaykh is a Sudas mitzvah in Erusin? Very, very odd kind of halacha. Now, I have two approaches. One approach is minhag. Rabbi Yossi recognized a minhag BIyun to make a Sudas Erusin. And this really boils down to the following question. Does a minhag have the power to create a Chal Hashem Sudas mitzvah? And I'm going to suggest the following. Again, please disagree with me. And I might be totally off base. But if the minhag reflects chesed, meaning it's a bein adam lechavero, then the minhag could generate a sudas mitzvah. The purpose of a sudas mitzvah is to gather together the people for a simcha. Because whenever we have a simcha that imposes a chiyuv simcha imposed on a tzibur, we have what's called a suda. For example, Simchas Chas V'Kal itself is a raya. The suda of Simchas Chas V'Kal is not limited to Nesuah, and it applies for 7 days in the case of a bacher and a basula, or 3 days if he's an almana, he's an almond, she's an almana, all the dinim there Masechet Ksubas. But those 7 days are days of simcha, and therefore they require suda. Participation in a suda during the 7 days of simcha is participation in a sudas mitzvah. Our Mishnah wanted to suggest that whenever you gather together for the simcha of the chassan and the kala, even though technically, according to the strict rigid halachos, we would not define it as simcha because it's only Erusin, but if the community on its own, I would call it a spontaneous generated simcha to be mesameach the chassan v'kala during Erusin, then that sets up and generates a sudas mitzvah. We have an obligation to be mesameach the chassan v'kala in the framework of this minhag to set up a sudas Erusin. And again, the nafkamina is going to be that an avel, Rahman al-San, will not be permitted to partake in the sudas Erusin. I have my doubts if the chassan himself is Rahman al-San and avel, if he's allowed to participate in the sudas Erusin according to Rabbi Yossi, because the essence of the mitzvah is simcha. And if we are generating simcha at the time of Erusin, if that's the power of the minhag, then that's antithetical to Avelis. Now we know that minhag BIyun has a certain very, very definite power. And the best example in my mind is the minhag of Yontif Sheni Shel Golios, which today is only a minhag. We know, based on the calendar of Hil Hasheni, exactly when Yontif is. We don't have any Sveika Diyoma. And the Gemara at the beginning of Beitza says, Minhag Avoseichen B'yedcha. We have also Hallel on Rosh Chodesh is only a minhag. And yet, at least according to Rabbeinu Tam, we make a bracha on Hallel. No one denies that on Yontif Sheni Shel Golios, we're going to recite a bracha not just on Hallel, but on Lulav and on Matzah and on Sukkah and so forth and so on. So you see that there is within the power of a minhag to generate what we call Kedushas HaZman, that the Zman itself takes on the status of Kedusha, and by virtue of what? Where does that Kedusha emanate from? Only from minhag. For example, when I set up a Su'uda on Yontif in Chutz La'aretz on the second day of Yontif, does that Su'uda have the status of Simcha and a Sudas mitzvah? For sure it does. It's minhag avoseichen b'yedchem. We can be mekadesh the zman. In terms of Erusin, what we're saying is that we can engender a simcha of nesuin at Erusin. So I understand in Zman we have a precedent to extend the Zman of Kiddush Hayom from Yontif Rishon to Yontif Sheni. Is it possible that a minhag has the power to create a makom simcha, which is in anticipation of the ultimate marriage? Now let's ask another question, and perhaps it's relevant. Is there a bracha on Erusin? There is a bracha on Erusin. Birchas Erusin. In fact, the Rambam writes that if he went ahead and he gave her kedusha, and then he reminds himself that he didn't make a bracha, it's too late. The bracha, like any birchas mitzvah, has to be over l'asiyasa. Then the Rambam is assuming there's a mitzvah of Erusin. If there's a mitzvah of Erusin, then you could take that mitzvah and attach it to a Suda. And here I want to say something way out. And again, don't accept it. That any minhag could take any mitzvah and attach a Suda to that mitzvah and make it into a Sudas mitzvah. So, for example, if you have a mitzvah like Milah, then the minhag could establish a Su'udas mitzvah for Milah. If you have a mitzvah of Korban Pesach, and we gather together to eat the Korban Pesach, in the context of that mitzvah, of Achilas Korban Pesach, we can set up a Sudas mitzvah. Now, the truth is, I don't even know if I'm adding anything, because it's a yontif. So if it's yontif and we're eating the basar of Korban Pesach at night, we anyway have a Sudas mitzvah. But you know what? Let's say he ate a Sudas mitzvah without eating the Korban Pesach. And then he gets to the Afikoman, he's already benched, and now he is about to eat a Kezayis basar Pesach. He could set up a Sudas mitzvah. So that Rabbi Yossi argues that if Erusin is a mitzvah, which again, not all Rishonim will agree. The Ravid, for example, takes opposition to the Rambam, and he says, no, you cannot make a bracha on Erusin. Again, it could be the Ravid is bothered by technicality, because maybe she'll refuse and disappoint us. So you'll be stuck with a bracha of Atol. But there are Rishonim who will say that there's no birchas ha-mitzvah on Erusin. Erusin is only a kinyan, and perhaps that's the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda at this point in the Sugi. The Gemara is going to change its tune. If Erusin is nothing more than a kinyan, it's a kinyan ishus. There's no mitzvah of Erusin. The mitzvah is nesuin. It's fascinating that the birchas Erusin that we're familiar with has both Erusin and nesuin in it. She'asa lonas harusos lanu, which is a reference to Erusin, and then vehiter lonas and nesus lanu they chuppah v'kedushin. So we mentioned not only kedushin, which is Erusin, but we also mentioned chuppah. In which case we integrate both elements of Ishus into the bracha, because both elements together integrate to form one whole mitzvah of Ki'ikach Ish Ish. But certainly Ki'ikach, as Erusin, is a mitzvah. And now we're gathering together for that mitzvah, and we're establishing a Sudas mitzvah. The Gemara says the following. Rav Chizda is going to change our whole perspective on Rabbi Yehuda. Our perspective on Rabbi Yehuda is that Erusin is completely devoid of the status of a Seudas mitzvah. Maybe it's even devoid of the status of a mitzvah. Then, says Rav Chizda, Hashd Yom Rav Chizda, Machlokes b'Seuda Shniya, al b'Seuda Rishona Divrei Akol Mitzvah. Bosai, not only do we have a radical new idea of a Sudas Erusin, but we now have two Sudas Erusins. There's a Suda Rishona and a Suda Shniya. Again, in Nisuin, you have the Suda at the Shas Nisuin after the Chuppah, and you have another bunch of Sudos for the next 7 days. Erusin, we thought, was completely alien to Suda. The concept of Suda is totally alien to Erusin. And now, Rav Chizda tells us that everybody agrees that there's a Sudas mitzvah in Erusin. Rav Yossi took it one step further. Not only is there one Suda, but there's a second Suda. And Rabbi Yehuda disagreed about the second Suda. What is the status of the second Suda? So the brisa that combines holech liknos shvisa of Rishus together with Holech L'Sudas Erusin, that Brisa reflects Rabbi Yehuda, but only vis-a-vis the second Suda. As far as the first Suda is concerned, the Mishnah is unanimously accepted that if he's on his way to Suda Rishona of Erusin, that is a Suda's mitzvah. And if it means that he has to give up on the mitzvah of Bir Chametz because he won't have time to go back and forth, that's what's going to happen. The Rabbanan are going to alleviate him of the Chiyuv Bir Chametz in favor of the Sudas mitzvah of Erusin, Sudas Erusin, and everybody, even Rabbi Yehuda, agrees that that Suda Rishona is a mitzvah. Now, what is this Suda Shniya that Rabbi Yossi postulates also has the status of a Sudas mitzvah? We had enough trouble with the Suda Rishona. So let's go on in the Gemara. Gemara says, Afilu Tema, according to Rav, in the light of Rav Chiz's Chiddush, Ha Rabbi Yehuda, both the Mishnah and the Brisa can be attributed to Rabbi Yehuda, below Kasha. Ha, the Mishnah that allows you to give up on Bir Chametz if need be for the sake of the Sudas Erusin, Besuda Rishona. And that's a mitzvah even according to Rabbi Yehuda. But Ha, the Brisa that combines the Sudas Erusin together with Hayaholech Lishmos Shvisas Rishus, that is a reference to Suda Shniya, which according to Rabbi Yehuda is a Sudas Rishus. Tanya, we have a Brisa. And the Brisa records the machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. As far as Sudas Erusin is concerned, is it a mitzvah? But the Brisa actually sheds a light on this machlokas, which will support Rav Chizd. Rabbi Yehuda, Nilo Shamati, I never heard that there's a mitzvah of a Sudas Erusin, Ella, the Suda Rishona, Avolo, Sivlonos. Okay, now Sivlonos is going to give us a Suda Shniya. And Abula Rabbi Yossi, Ani Shamati, Suudas Erusin Visivlonos. Now, I want to ask two questions here. The obvious question is, what does Sivlonos have to do with the price of fish in China? I mean, after all, Sivlonos is a very nice thing, and the chassan is sending gifts to the Kala. I was actually a shliach for my brother. I'm going back to when I was yay high to bring Sivlonos to my sister-in-law, Shulzain Gezud. I'm talking about over 50 years ago. But Sivlonos is a nice thing. I mean, the Gemara is not so happy about Mishloach Monos between a Chassan and a Kala. That's during Erusin. I'm not sure if that has any application to an engaged couple today, but back in the day when there was Erusin, as a real Doraisa, sending Mishloach Monos was a whole issue. And that depends upon the definition of Sivlonos, which we'll get to in just a minute. My second question is, why this emphasis on Ani Shamati, Ani Lo Shamati? I understand that we have what's called the Mesores HaTorah. But if that's what's going on here, then every single statement in Shas, I mean, I could do a word search throughout Shas, it should be Omar so-and-so, Ani Shamati. I mean, all of Torah depends upon a Mesorah. Why here Ani Shamati? And again, I think it has to do with the concept of a minhag. A minhag has to be something that was accepted by the masses. You can't tell me that Reuven and Shimon and Levi have decided, we have a 3 musketeer chabura, we're going to create a new minhag. That's not how minhagim are created. Minhagim are valid, and they have halachic significance, but it's got to be a minhag of the tzibur. And unless you heard about it, it's very unlikely that the tzibur had that minhag. So that Rabbi Yossi says, you know what? I heard about a minhag to set up a suda at the moment of Sivlonos. Rabbi Yehuda says, I never heard of it. If I never heard of it, then it's not a minhag, it's not valid, and there's no way you can generate the status of a Seudas mitzvah. It's a Seudas rishus. And the nafkamina now is a great nafkamina, l'gabi the mitzvah d'Rabbanan, after bittul, of bir chametz. If it's a Seudas rishus, then there's no waiving of the mitzvah of bir chametz. If it's a Seudas mitzvah, then under certain circumstances, that Suda will trump the mitzvah bir chametz d'Rabbanan. What's this whole business all about? I want to read to you a note over here, and he says the following, that Tosfos has this tema, and Nira, he says, I'm reading to you a commentary on Tosfos. Just give me 1 second here. Okay. Tema. He says, what is this source of this Suda Shnia? Nira Shesuda Sivlonos hi Suda Shnia means, according to Rabbi Yossi, the second Suda is a Suda Sivlonos, and it is a Suda Shnia, which means, according to Rabbi Yossi, it's a Sudas mitzvah. And Al Suda Zu Omer Av Chizda Shenechleku Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbi Yossi Ha'im Sudas Mitzvahi O Lo. Now, this brisa that we're quoting here supports Rav Chizda, who said that the only machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi is regarding Suda Shnia. Aval b'Suda Rishona Kule Alma Kula Modim Shi Suda Mitzvah. So that this brisa now is a support for Rav Chizda. The Chassam Sofer is a little bothered by this, because usually when the Gemara quotes a brisa as support, it usually adds a few words, Tanya Nami Hachi, or Tana de Messiah. Here it just says Tanya. So the Chassam Sofer says that although this brisa records a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi with regard to Sivlonos, he says, Eino muchach, it's not necessarily so, Shesuda Shnia, the second Suda, which you remember that Rav Chizda had presented that the Suda Shnia is a machlokes between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda, Shehi Suda Sivlonos, Yitochen, Shehi Suda Nosefes Chutz Mi Sivlonos, Umi Suda Sivlonos. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi Nechleku B'Shtei Sudas Elu Ha'im Hein Mitzvah Olo. So the Chassam Sofer complicates matters, because he says that there are 3 sudas. You know, we're having trouble with 2 sudas. He says that the second suda that Rav Chizda mentioned before as the machlok shin Rav Yossi is not to be identified with the suda Sivlonos in the brisa. So this brisa is not being quoted by the Gemara as a support text for Rav Chizda, because this brisa records a machlokas Rav Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda about Suda Sivlonos, which is a 3rd Suda, says the Chassam Sofer. Why is Suda Sivlonos, according to Rabbi Yossi, a Suda's mitzvah? Once again, you're going to tell me there's a minhag, But what's the extra dimension of simcha? I understand that with regard to Nisuin, Chazal established 7 days of simcha. Some cases, 3 days of simcha, 1 day, whatever the numbers are. There's also 30 days. But in the case of Sivlonos, what's the big simcha over here? So I mentioned to you earlier that there's a whole issue about sending Sivlonos during an engagement period, or back in the time of Chazal during the Erusin. And the Gemara records in Masechet Kedushin Machlokes about whether Chayshinim l'Kedushin or not. Do you remember this? Because, again, a person set up an agreement with a woman that they will get married. The marriage is effectuated when he gives her kesef, shava pruta, in front of 2 eidim for the purpose of Kiddush. What happens if he sends sivlonos? Now, again, in our society, I have a friend down in Florida. He makes his parnasa from creating lockets, which a young man who's dating a girl, and he wants to impress her with a gift, he'll buy this locket, and inside it'll say Valentine's Day. I don't know what it says inside, but anyway. But back in the time of the Gemara, at least in the Jewish community, it wasn't so common that boys went out with girls and they sent them gifts. And if we know under certain circumstances, let's say the father of this girl has already given his consent for marriage, that if he sends her sivlonos, the Gemara says maybe if he does it publicly, or at least in front of 2 witnesses, he is sending it for the purpose of Kiddush. And I mentioned to you this Gemara because sivlonos, which classically means gifts that were sent after the Erusin, could also be kesef Kiddushin. So that once we elevate Erusin to the status of a Seudas mitzvah, again in the context of that minhag, we don't know why there should be according to some sofer a second Seudas mitzvah for Erusin. Why one is not sufficient? There's no time period like that parallels Shivas Yimei Mishter after Nisuin. How many days of Erusin? I mean, Erusin could take 12 months. But where's the Suda Rishona? Where's the Suda Shniya? I assume the Suda Rishona is somehow very close in time, very proximate to the actual Erusin. But I have no clue when the second Sudas Erusin is done. Maybe after 6 months. I don't know. When is the second Sudas Erusin? The Samsova doesn't give us a clue. But Sivlonos, that already is taking us on the way to complete the Ishus. It's another stage of Ishus. Haraya, that Sivlonos itself could be Ishus, could be a Maisa Kiddushin. The Gemara says, according to one man, the Omer Chayshinon, the Kiddushin shall need a get if they don't consummate, if they don't follow through with the marriage. And Sivlonos apparently is a big deal. So much so that it could be Kesef Kiddushin. And now, says Rabbi Yossi, I understand that there was a minhag that when he sent us Sivlonos, and again, the concept of Sivlonos has to do with what's called, see if I can remember the Gemara's language at the beginning of Ksubis, Kidei Lechavava. I think that's the language of the Gemara. If somebody has a Gemara Ksubis, you'll take a look. I think it's, again, I'm not a Baki, but approximately Daf Yud Aleph. The Gemara says that in Yehuda, right, Eretz Yisrael is divided up into 3 parts, and there was a minhag in Yehuda that during the Erusin, they would actually, I don't want to use the word lock up, but they would, they would put the Chassid Kala, the Oris and the Erusin in a private in a private room. And the Gemara asks why there's no Isur Yichud and so forth. And all this is Kedei Lechavava. Because again, you have to imagine that a man marries a woman and 12 months are going to go by until they reach the chuppah. And she's living in her father's house. So how do you engender and maintain some sort of a chiba, a relationship between the Oris and the Arusa during this 12-month separation period? I don't know how many dates they went on before the Erusin. So if you come from a borough park, you may know that in some circles in borough park, the chas and the kala meet once. They go for a walk around the block. They come back in, and the two sets of parents sit together with the chas and the kala, and they clinch the engagement. So I don't know exactly what went on back at the time of the Gemara. But in the Erusin situation, it's a very awkward situation. And, there are a lot of other men in the world. So, we have a whole parsha in the Torah, V'nara Murasa Shezinsa. If she's a Bas Kohen, she gets Sreifa. We have to somehow engender that relationship. Ad Kedei Kach that the Gemara says that they were miyached the chas and the kala together during Erusin, the Oris and the Arusa. And how could that be? He's not allowed to have a relationship with her. The Gemara talks about whether we assume he did have a relationship with her or not in that yichud situation. So the Sivlonos is all part of this ongoing development of an Ishus relationship. Ad Kedei Kach, as we said before, that maybe even Chayshina L'Kedushin in a case where there was no Erusin, maybe the Sivlonos is a substitute for Erusin. Now we have a little bit of an Agadita here. Let's see what the clock says. All right, maybe we could chop right a drop of this Agadita. It's a relatively short Agadita. Tanya Rabbi Shimon Omer Kol Suda She'ena Shel Mitzvah Ein Talmid Chacham Rashay Lehenos Mimen. A Talmid Chacham has to be very careful, number one, about his time. He's got to dedicate his time to the study of Torah. And secondly, he has to be very careful about where he hangs out, with whom he's hanging out. So people get together to shoot the breeze and, to have some sort of a lovely outing, a dinner together, picnic together, and he gets exposed to all sorts of different types of people. And that's not something that he's allowed to do. Kigon Mai. Now, the Gemara wants to go further here and express the idea that even if people are getting together for what you think might be a Sudas mitzvah, even so, the Talmid Chacham should avoid participation because it's not really a Sudas mitzvah. Rabbi Yochanan has two examples. Number one, Kigon, Bas Kohen li Yisrael. This is unbelievable. Back in the day, they had what's called a Kohen Biyuchas. I know of one person that I know personally, he claims he's a Kohen Biyuchas. And a Kohen Biyuchas has to marry a Bas Kohen. Again, we have to learn Masechet Ksubas for this to realize the Yuchsin of Kohenim and how important that was. So for a Kohen to marry a Bas Yisrael, that's like undermining the whole Yichus of Kahuna. That Suda, the Talmid Chacham should avoid. Number two, a Bas Talmid Chacham Liyam Haaretz. Imagine a man is a great scholar, and he marries off his daughter to an Am Haaretz. Now again, Am Haaretz doesn't mean what you and I think it means, namely somebody who can't take an exam, even in the in the Chaver program. He's a total ignoramus. No, that's not what Am Haaretz is. Am Haaretz means that he's chashud, he's suspect of violating various basic mitzvahs. The Omar Rabbi Yochanan Bas Kohen Yisrael Ein Zivugam Ola Yof. And in the Hebrew translation, he says Ola Yof means b'mazel tov, good fortune. There won't be good fortune coming out of this couple. And again, you might ask, why is Rabbi Yochanan so harsh that this marriage is not going to lead to any simcha? Because she's a Bas Yisrael and he's a Kohen. Or she's a Bas Kohen and he's Yisrael. Maihi, what is the terrible thing that's going to happen? Unbelievable. As a result of this marriage between a Bas Kohen and Yisrael, she'll either be widowed or divorced or barren. Masnisa Tana, we have a brisa in terms of a case of a Bas Kohen that gets married to Yisrael. There are two possible things that are going to happen. Kovra, either she'll die before her time and he'll have to bury her, or Kobarto, or he'll die before the Zman and she'll have to bury him. Or alternatively, Mivi Oso Lidei Anius. She is going to bring poverty into the marriage. I have a footnote in the name of the Ben Yehoyada, that's the Ben Ish Chai. He says, Kol ze nemar dafkal zmanom, shahayu kohanim yuchasim, v'yamei ha'aretz hayu chotim, avol bizmanenu, shakohanim enom yuchasim, ela rak bechezkas kohanim, whatever that means, that's a long discussion, but amei ha'aretz enom chotim, is lo nemer bahem dvarim elu umutar liyama aretz loses bas kohen. He doubles it over. Not only is this bas kohen getting married to Yisrael, but Yisrael is also an amoritz. And he says bechozos tov li zar bazeh, meaning in shidduchim we should still be very careful. The Gemara asks, Eini, is this really so? So we're talking about a non-Kohen, and we're encouraging him. This is the same Rabbi Yochanan, to marry a Bas Kohen. How could Rabbi Yochanan encourage such a marriage? And Kolchkein Shetorah Ukahuna Miashra. How much more so will he get this Hashirus as a great reward if he marries into a Torah family, and yet he is not a Torah scholar? The Gemara says, Lo kasha, when Rabbi Yochanan said that he will have this Hashirus, this reward of wealth, he was talking to a Talmid Chacham who's marrying a Bas Kohen. Now, you might say, well, she's a Bas Kohen. I mean, she comes from Aaron Kohen, and she's not marrying a Kohen. The answer is that Aaron is very, very happy. He's overjoyed by this marriage because she's marrying a Talmid Chacham. And that's what Rabbi Yochanan said, that Ein Zivugam Yafa, they should avoid such a marriage because he's not a Kohen or she's not a Bas Kohen. That's B'Ama Oretz. This fellow who's marrying a Bas Kohen is an Ama Oretz, and therefore Aaron is very insulted. So we got up to Rabbi Yeshua Nosiv Kahanta, and we have another few lines to finish up the Agada to Bli Neder. We'll finish that up tomorrow. Thank you so much, and have a great day.